if you're looking for a clearer picture of major global events, to really get behind the headlines, well, that's exactly what we're aiming for today. We're doing a deep dive into how U.S. oil and natural gas became entangled with a huge geopolitical crisis,
Yeah.
conflict in Ukraine.
That's right. When Russia invaded Ukraine back in February 2022, it sent, well, shockwaves everywhere, didn't it? And the energy sector was definitely right there in the middle of it.
And the U.S. role is key here.
Exactly. The U.S. is the world's top producer of oil and natural gas. So it found itself in this really unique, influential spot. We've been looking at expert analysis, industry reports, news accounts, trying to piece together how big a factor U.S. energy actually was.
Right. And our mission here for you listening is to unpack all of that. We want to explore how U.S. energy maybe unexpectedly shaped the conflict, how it affected, say, Europe's energy situation,
Yeah.
Russia's leverage, and what it all means long-term for energy and, global politics.
So where should we start? Before the invasion?
Yeah, let's set the stage. What did the energy world look like, say, late 2021, early 2022?
Okay, well, to really get the U.S. influence, you have to understand the shale revolution first. That was transformative. We're talking roughly 2008 to 2020.
Right, the fracking boom.
Exactly. U.S. oil production basically doubled in that time. And by 2011, the U.S. was already the world's biggest producer of natural gas. And then, get this, by 2019, it became a net exporter of energy. First time in decades.
That really is a fundamental shift, isn't it? A game changer on the world stage. So how did that U.S. position stack up against Russia's leading up to the conflict?
Well, it's quite a stark contrast, actually. Russia's economy was, and still is, very heavily dependent on selling its oil and gas.
Like how dependent?
In 2021, something like 40% of their entire federal budget revenue came from energy exports. 40%.
Wow.
So very reliant. And then you look at Europe. Before the invasion, they were getting about 40% of their natural gas and maybe 25% of their oil from Russia.
So a huge vulnerability there for Europe.
A significant one, yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we have Europe needing Russian energy, Russia needing the revenue, and the U.S. now this major energy player. Then the invasion happens. What were the immediate energy shockwaves? And how did the U.S. respond?
Well, it's interesting. Europe's gas prices were already climbing in late 2021, so the problem wasn't brand new.
Yeah.
But the invasion just poured gasoline on the fire, basically.
Right.
And what happened next was this dramatic surge in U.S. liquefied natural gas, LNG, heading to Europe.
How dramatic are we talking?
We're talking a 141% increase in U.S. LNG exports to Europe in just the first half of 2022 compared to the year before.
Oh, 141%. That's massive.
It really is.
Yeah.
And by 2023, the U.S. was supplying something like 40% of all of Europe's LNG imports. A huge pivot.
That kind of rerouting in such a short time,
Yeah.
it suggests a huge effort behind the scenes, right?
Yeah.
People working flat out.
Oh, absolutely. U.S. LNG export terminals were running pretty much near maximum capacity. And at the same time, you saw Europe scrambling, really accelerating the construction of new import terminals to actually receive all this LNG.
So they needed places to dock the ships and regasify the fuel.
Exactly. Both sides of the Atlantic working, full tilt.
So strategically then, how did this flood of U.S. energy into Europe actually influence the conflict itself?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting geopolitically. Essentially, these increased U.S. LNG exports significantly weakened Russia's ability to use gas as a weapon against Europe.
Ah, the energy weapon they talked about.
Precisely. By providing a real, viable alternative source, the U.S. basically diluted the leverage Russia thought it had by threatening supply cuts. It made it harder for Putin to, say, split the Western alliance using energy pressure.
So it took away one of Russia's main cards in a way.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. And don't forget U.S. domestic production, too, plus those releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Right, the SPR releases.
Those helped cushion the blow on global oil prices, helped absorb some of the shock after the invasion and the sanctions kicked in, brought some stability, or at least prevented things from getting even worse.
So it sounds like U.S. energy shipments were pretty crucial. They bought Europe time.
Definitely. Vital support. It gave Europe more runway to get sanctions in place, start looking for longer-term energy solutions, and, crucially, keep supporting Ukraine.
But it couldn't have been a perfect fix, surely. You can't just swap massive pipelines full of Russian gas for shiploads of U.S. LNG overnight, can you? There must have been limits.
No, you're absolutely right to flag that. There were real limitations. Even with the surge, U.S. LNG export capacity just wasn't big enough to fully replace the sheer volume of that Russian pipeline gas Europe was used to.
Okay.
And even with Europe building new terminals fast, there were still bottlenecks, infrastructure issues, getting the gas where it needed to go within Europe.
And what about back in the U.S.? Did Americans feel this at all?
Oh, definitely. There were domestic impacts. Remember gasoline prices? They hit record highs. The national average went over $5 a gallon in June 2022.
I remember that, yeah.
And natural gas prices for American homes and businesses went up too. So exporting all that energy wasn't without costs domestically.
I imagine that fueled some pretty intense political debates here at home.
It certainly did. Big arguments about, should we drill more, even with climate change concerns? Was using the strategic reserve the right move? Lots of different opinions, lots of political heat around those decisions.
It sounds like such a high-pressure, complex time. Were there any specific stories or incidents from that period that really stand out that kind of illustrate what was happening on the ground?
Oh yeah, some really vivid examples. There was what people started calling the Great Gas Pivot. Remember when Russia choked the Nord Stream 1 pipeline flow way down in July 2022?
Yes, that caused panic in Europe.
Right. Well, U.S. LNG operators, companies like Venture Global down in Louisiana, they were reportedly working around the clock, literally redirecting LNG tankers that were originally headed for Asia, diverting them mid-ocean to Europe. People called it an emergency gas flotilla.
Wow. Redirecting ships mid-journey.
Yeah, reports mentioned terminal workers pulling insane shifts, like 18 hours, some even sleeping on site just to manage this massive, urgent rerouting.
Yeah.
Really highlights the pressure.
Oh, that's incredible. What else?
Well, then there was the Freeport LNG explosion in Texas, June 2022. That was a big deal.
What happened?
An explosion and fire knocked out a major export terminal. Took about 20% of U.S. LNG export capacity offline, just like that.
20%, right when Europe desperately needed it.
Exactly. European gas prices jumped immediately, something like 16% on the news, and it created this race against time to get Freeport back online before winter hit Europe. Huge repair effort.
Shows how tightly connected everything is. An accident in Texas sends prices soaring in Germany.
Absolutely. And here's another one, kind of different. The Texas-Ukraine direct line.
What was that?
This was apparently a private sector thing. A Houston energy trader used contacts, I think in Poland, to set up a direct supply chain of U.S. diesel fuel straight to the Ukrainian military.
Private sector, not government aid.
Apparently operating alongside it, yeah.
Yeah.
Starting early on, March 2022, reports suggest they delivered something like 25 million gallons by October that year, directly fueling the war effort.
That's quite a story. A private pipeline, essentially.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something about the winter that wasn't.
Ah, yes. So heading into the winter of 2022-2023, there was widespread fear in Europe. Catastrophic shortages, people freezing.
I remember the headlines. Germany firing up old coal plants, people stocking firewood.
Exactly that. But the worst case scenario didn't happen. Partly it was luck the winter turned out to be milder than expected. But also, crucially, those massive U.S. LNG shipments had helped them fill their gas storage tanks way up, like 95% full by November 2022. Plus, Europeans really cut back on energy use. So the combination averted disaster.
Mild weather and U.S. LNG saved the day, basically.
It was a huge factor, yeah, along with conservation efforts.
So moving on from the immediate crisis, what about the economic side? Who benefited from all this?
Well, U.S. energy companies certainly did well. You saw record profits reported. ExxonMobil, for instance, had its best year ever in 2022.
Why such big profits?
But largely because U.S. LNG exporters could buy natural gas relatively cheaply in the U.S. and sell it for much, much higher prices in Europe, where the shortage was acute. That price difference, the arbitrage, was huge.
Right. And jobs. Did this create jobs in the U.S.?
It seems so. Texas, for example, added tens of thousands of oil and gas jobs in 2022 and 2023. And building all these new LNG terminals and the pipelines feeding them, that means construction jobs, engineering jobs, operational jobs.
And these weren't just temporary fixes, right? You mentioned infrastructure investments.
No, definitely not just temporary. We saw moves to fast-track approvals for new LNG export terminals, expanding pipeline capacity. These are long-term, multi-billion-dollar investments. They signal a lasting commitment from the U.S. to be a major global energy supplier.
So looking beyond the immediate crisis and the economics, what are the big, lasting changes to the global energy map that we're seeing because of all this?
There are some really profound shifts underway. I mean, first, Europe is clearly accelerating its move away from Russian energy. That's a fundamental strategic pivot. It won't happen overnight, but the direction is clear.
Diversification.
Exactly. And that naturally means stronger energy trade ties between the U.S. and Europe, more interdependence there.
And Russia, what are they doing?
They're looking east. trying to sell more oil and gas to Asia, particularly China and India. They're also working on things like alternative payment systems, trying to bypass Western financial sanctions. It's forcing them to reorient their entire energy export strategy.
So a major realignment of global energy flows.
Precisely. And you also see the U.S. taking on a much more explicit role as like an energy security guarantor for its allies, new energy deals being signed with European countries, and even organizations like NATO are now integrating energy security much more deeply into their defense planning.
Energy is security now, basically.
It always was to some extent, but now it's front and center, undeniably a critical piece of national and international security.
Okay, so if we were to boil it all down,
Mhm.
it seems pretty clear that U.S. oil and natural gas played this really significant, kind of complex role throughout the Ukraine conflict, impacting everything from energy supplies to geopolitics to, well, global economics.
That sums it up well. The U.S. energy sector provided, crucial leverage and support during a massive international crisis. It really underscored just how intertwined energy, politics, and security are today.
It really does. It gives you a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And considering these lasting shifts we've discussed, the new energy map, the focus on security,
Ooh.
what kinds of maybe new challenges or even opportunities does this create for the U.S. and its allies going forward? It makes you wonder what the next chapter looks like after this big energy pivot.
That's the big question, isn't it? What comes next?
Definitely something to keep watching. Thank you for walking us through all that complexity today.
My pleasure.